Good morning, church. It's great to be together again, isn't it, for Church Online? If you're meeting with us for the first time, you're very, very welcome. It's great to have you with us. If you're able to, if you could just leave a comment on the video, either through YouTube or through Facebook, or send us an email, then we'd love to know that you've been with us this morning and maybe keep in touch with you a bit more as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark. My wife Rhiannon and I have been coming to City Church, part of the family here, for very nearly 10 years now. We have 3 small children. I'm a primary school teacher and I tell lies. I don't know whether you've heard an introduction to a talk like that before, but sadly it is the truth, and I don't think I'm alone in that. In fact, science tells me, or at least the National Geographic magazine tells me, that I'm not alone. In a report published in that magazine, it said that children develop the ability to lie by the age of 2. Now, bearing in mind they don't develop the ability to talk much earlier than that, it says quite a lot about our human nature, doesn't it? It goes on to say that by the age of 6, 35% of children will tell lies in multiple times in any one day. And then it gets worse. By our teenage years, the study says that 60% of teenagers will lie up to 5 times a day, and a further 15%, so that's 75%, will lie more than 5 times a day. Now, we do seem to get a bit more truthful as we get a bit older, so by the time we're pulling our pension in our 60s and 70s, 34% of people tell lies up to 5 times a day, and a further 10% lie more than that. And it said that the main reason why people lie is either to promote ourselves or to protect ourselves. We lie to promote ourselves or to protect ourselves. And in today's passage, as we continue our look through Matthew 5 on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, we come to this section that I think is about telling the truth and speaking the truth. And so if you have a Bible, why don't you turn to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 33 as we're going to start from today. And it says this: Jesus is talking and he says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn.' But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not take an oath on your own head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than that comes from evil." Now, the title that the ESV gives to this, and to the NIV as well, is oaths. And the NIV uses the word vow instead of sworn, but we don't usually use any of those words in our day-to-day language. We might use the word promise instead. We might say, use those words, for example, if we swear an oath, if we're a character witness in a court. We might swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And on our wedding days, we say vows to our partner to love, honour, cherish and obey them for the rest of our life, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. But as I said, we probably use the word promise rather than oaths and vows. However, in Jesus' day, it was very common to make oaths. And the difference between an oath and a promise is that it was assigned to something. So traditionally, in a courthouse, you would swear to tell the truth and you would place your hand on the Bible, and the Bible was supposed to confirm that promise, to confirm that oath to tell the truth. In primary schools, I've heard similar. I've heard someone say, "I swear on my mother's life that I'm telling the truth," or even "I swear on my hamster's guts," which sounds disgusting, doesn't it? Or the common one is "cross my heart and hope to die." It's a similar thing, that when we make a promise, we assign it to something to show that we are going to fulfill it, that we are honest about that intention. Our intentions are honest about that promise. And just like the other occasions that we've looked at already as we've been going through Matthew 5, Jesus says, "You have heard it said." Now, when he says that, he's not talking about a particular verse. We can't go to a particular quote and say, this is where it says this. It was more talking about the general teaching, the general theology of the day that was being taught by the scribes and the Pharisees. But if we were to try to narrow this down a bit, I think this morning in this passage, Jesus is talking about the 3rd commandment, which says, "Do not take the Lord's name in vain," and also the 9th commandment, which is to not bear false witness. And so Jesus is looking to redirect, to reshape the teaching and theology of the day based around these 2 commandments. When we looked at the Pharisees a few weeks ago, We saw that they would often add buffers and barriers to the laws that God had given. Their intention may have been good, that they were going to protect that law and not break it. But what they had done is they had added these extra barriers, which became extra burdens to the people. And that's what Jesus didn't like about their teaching and their practices. So the Pharisees, they knew that the law prevented them from taking the Lord's name in vain. And so they were very, very strict about this. They wouldn't even use the Lord's name. And they would write, and when they wrote it down, they would only use the consonants. So instead of saying Yahweh, they would say Yahweh, which is just the consonants, the sounds. And it's a bit like gobbledygook. Nowadays, it didn't make any sense, but they were so particular about not using the name of the Lord in case it was in vain. They refused to actually say his name aloud. In this passage, Jesus says, he acknowledges that they know not to use the name of the Lord, but what they've actually done is they've added in these extra things that they say they can use to swear and to bind their promises to. So Jesus talks about these four things. We've got heaven, earth, Jerusalem, and their own heads. And so Jesus is simply pointing out and saying, you're still doing it. Although you may not be using the Lord's name, Yahweh, you're still using things and assigning things to him. Whether it's heaven, which is where God lives, it's where he rules, where he sits on his throne. Whether it's earth, which is God's kingdom, it's where he rules and reigns, and it's his footstool, the word it says in the passage, didn't it? Whether it's Jerusalem, which is said was the city of God, city of the king, and that's both King David, who established Jerusalem as his capital city in the Old Testament, but it's also talking about King Jesus, who through capital punishment established the New Jerusalem, or a pathway to the New Jerusalem that we read about in Revelation. And then he talks about swearing on your own heads, and he says you can't even change the color of one hair. Now, nowadays, we may bleach or dye our hair to cover up the colours that may be coming through. But in those days, you couldn't do that, or it was less common anyway. And so Jesus is saying you can't change and choose your own colour hair. God does that. God is in control of everything, even down to the single hairs in your life. You're still assigning these words and promises to the authority of God, and you're using his name in vain. Jesus then goes on to say that we shouldn't actually just make vows. We shouldn't do it. We shouldn't swear on these things. And because of the tradition, that was the tradition of the day, we could just look at this passage and say, well, we don't make vows anymore, so therefore this passage doesn't mean anything to us. But I think that's a little bit dangerous to do. Jesus talks about this passage again a bit later on in Matthew 23. And by this stage, he's towards the end of his ministry. And he's made real enemies of the scribes and the Pharisees because he keeps correcting the ways that they are teaching. And so by Matthew 23, when he comes back to this passage, his tone has changed. Just listen to this. Woe to you, blind guides, who says that if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. And if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound to the oath. You blind fools. For which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift of the altar, he is bound to his oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. And so Jesus is calling them back to this passage. Can you hear how he's changed his tone? Can you hear how he's clearly saying this is something that is important? You can't just turn away from it. Maybe he's talking to us in 21st century Britain. You can't just turn away from this passage. There is still importance, even in your British culture, for it today. What the scribes and the Pharisees, particularly the Pharisees, had done is they had added these buffers and these barriers, but also loopholes. Not just were they trying to get away from not breaking the law, but in this passage we've just read in Matthew 23, they're trying to get around the promises that they are making as well. They've come up with this system where they've said, these things you can swear on and your promise is binding, but these things, you can't swear on these things. You can swear on these things because your promise isn't binding. And so not only did they have an intention of making a promise, they had an intention of breaking a promise. There were some things that they had to do. If they swore by this thing, they had to keep that promise. But if they swore by these things, then they didn't. And Jesus is saying that's not right. That's not how you should live. I suppose a modern day equivalent of that would be crossing our fingers, maybe behind our back. We're saying we're going to do one thing, but actually we have no intention of doing it. And false promises are lies, as I was talking about earlier. And that is what makes Jesus really cross. It's that disconnection, that hypocrite, that he calls them hypocrites. And he says you're living one way, but saying you're living in a completely different. That's what's making Jesus cross, that they're not living truthfully in their words and their actions. So these two passages aren't just about making oaths, although it is that as well. They're about speaking the truth and meaning the truth and living the truth. That's what's so important to us today. In our passage in Matthew 5, Jesus concludes by saying, simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything else comes from evil. And so in these words, he's basically saying, don't lie about it. Say what you mean and mean what you say. He's calling us to live a truthful life. Now, it's fairly obvious to see how in the Old Testament, Jesus is talking about the rules from the Old Testament and saying, these are where I am in the New Testament. This is the fulfillment of these laws. He's going back to the Ten Commandments. He's going back to the laws and the prophets. And he's saying, this is incorrect. How you're living shouldn't be like this. And he's setting an example of how we should live, or how the people in the day should live. That's quite obvious to see. But have you noticed how lots of the things that Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount also match up to what Jesus says about himself in John, in the Gospel of John? So, for example, a few weeks ago, Mark took us through the passage where Jesus says, you are the light of the world. And in John, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. In a few weeks' time, we're going to look in Matthew 5 at how Jesus is calling us to be givers, to give to those in need. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd who gives his life for those in need. And today, Jesus is calling us to be a truthful people. And in John, Jesus says about himself, I am the truth, the way, and the life. Jesus is calling us to be more like him. Now, that shouldn't be a surprise, because that's what Jesus is doing all the way through his ministry. He has come to correct that which was lost back in the garden. The very first action of sin in the Bible was that of a lie. We read in Genesis when Adam and Eve are in the garden, and the devil comes to Eve and he says, is it true that God has said you can't eat any of the fruit? And she says, no, that's not true. What is true is that we cannot eat from this tree, or we will surely die. And then the lie comes, and Satan says, you won't truly die. What God knows is that you will become more like him. You will know both good and evil, both good and bad. At that point, she should have realized that actually she was already made in the image of God. She already had that knowledge of goodness that she needed. What she was actually going to get, what mankind was actually going to get, was that knowledge of evil. And instead of becoming more godlike, she became more Satan-like. And throughout the generations, we have been doing the same thing. That's why it's so natural for a 2-year-old to be able to lie. Jesus calls the devil the father of lies because he was the one who told the original lie in the garden. But some translations translate that as the father of liars, meaning that if we tell lies, if we don't follow Jesus, we are Satan's children. He is our father. So we've got a bit like this picture of Satan, the father of liars on one side, and God or Jesus, the father of truth, on the other side. And it's a bit like those old Tom and Jerry cartoons, I guess, where they've got a demon sat on one side, a little devil sat here, and an angel sat on here, and they're both chuntering away, telling them what they should or shouldn't do. And they have a choice to make. And we have a choice to make as well. We can either choose to listen to the Father of truth, to Jesus, the way he is calling us to live, or we could listen to the Father of lies and the way that he is telling us how to live. Just by making a decision to listen to Jesus doesn't stop us from going through life's difficulties and challenges. In a few months' time, I will celebrate being a Christian for 30 years. 30 years since I made that decision to listen to Jesus and to follow him. And yet, as I said in my introduction, I still tell lies. Far more regularly than I would like, definitely more regularly than Jesus would like. But I said I was someone who tells lies. I didn't say that I was a liar. Because although the father of lies is the devil, Jesus is the father of truth. And so when I come to God and say, God, I want you to be my father. Jesus, I want you to be my savior. He adopts me as his son. He adopts you as his child, and he identifies you as that. He identifies you as one of his own. So when God looks upon the sin, the lies, the selfishness, the evil intentions that I still have in my own life, he sees those, and then he sees Jesus' blood covering them as well. Because yes, when Jesus hung on that cross, it was the nails that held him there. It was the physical metal through his wrists that held him in place on that wooden cross. But the people at the foot of the cross and the thieves either side of him were shouting, Jesus, come down off that cross. If you are who you say you are, get yourself off, save yourself and save us. And Jesus, he could have done that. He did many, many miracles throughout his ministry. He could have simply got off the cross and proven to all those around that he was who he said. But he didn't come just to prove it to those people. He came to prove it to you as well. And so he decided that he needed to hang on that cross and to stay suspended there. And it wasn't just the nails that stopped him from coming off that cross. What stopped him was my sin. The things that I have done wrong. My lies, my intentions when they've not been godly. The things that I've done that I shouldn't have done. The things that maybe you have done that you shouldn't have done. Those were the things that held Jesus on that cross and stopped him from coming off that tree. There's a song that I've been listening to recently, and there's a verse in it that says this: sometimes upon this journey I get lost in my own mistakes. What looks to me like my weakness is a canvas for your strength. My story isn't over. My story has just begun. My failures won't define me because that's what my Father does. My failures won't define me because that's what my Father does. We are defined by our Father. Whether we're the father of truth or we have the father of lies, that's who defines us. And so although Jesus wants us to make those right decisions, he knows that we are going to fall. He knows that we are going to fail. That's why he's given us this way that we should live. He's given us this Sermon on the Mount. He's given us the Bible. He's given us the blueprint of how we should live. But he knows that we're going to fall along the way. But all my faults and all my failures were hung on Jesus when he was on that cross. So I stand here today as someone who lies, not as someone who is a liar. Now, that is in no way an excuse for me to break God's law and to not live in the way that he wants me to. But it does mean that every time I break the law, there is forgiveness. It's not a license to sin. There's a verse in Proverbs where it says 6 things God hates, 7 things he detests, and lying is one of those things. God hasn't given me permission or a license to lie just because there's forgiveness at the end of it if I come to Jesus' cross. The Bible talks about our relationship as being like a marriage, our relationship with God. We are the bride, the church is bride, and he is the bridegroom. And so if I stood on my wedding day and I made my vows to my wife and then I broke them, not only would I be breaking the promises that I made, but I would also be breaking her heart. And the same is true with God. When we make a promise to live for him and to follow him, if we then go against that, yes, there's forgiveness. Yes, there's love. Yes, there's grace. But there's also heartbreak. The Father doesn't give us a license to sin, but he does give us a way back to him when we do things wrong. A sincere faith in Jesus means that although at times we may fail and fall short, we aim to live in a manner that follows him. Our words are truthful and they line up with our actions. We need to be people who are more loving, more caring, more humble, and more truthful. That's what Jesus is calling us to be in this passage. And as I said earlier, we have a choice. We have a choice of who we should listen to. We have a choice of who we want to direct and call the shots on our life. We can either choose to live for ourselves, to promote ourselves and to protect ourselves and go down that route of lies. Or we could look to the one who wants to promote, we promote someone else, we could promote Jesus, and he will protect us. We have a choice. Perhaps you're watching this morning and maybe you've never made that promise to Jesus. Perhaps you never made that choice to follow him. Or perhaps you made it quite a while ago and maybe the journey along your life has taken you in different directions that maybe Jesus wouldn't intend. Maybe that promise that you made, a bit like the Pharisees, you haven't kept to it as you once intended to. Well, today is a great day to make a choice again. And all we have to do is let our yes be yes. We truthfully and humbly just come to Jesus and acknowledge that we have done things wrong. And we ask for his forgiveness. We ask for his grace and his mercy. And we promise that we will live a life that reflects his truth out to the world. And you can do it something right now. Just saying some words like, Jesus, I'm sorry for the things that I've done wrong. Enter my life now, I pray. And I promise to live from this moment to choose a life of truth and live your way. We could use words, you could use words like that. If you want to rewind this video and go through those words again, you're very, very welcome to. And if you have made that promise or intend to make that promise or would like some more help and information about how you can live that way, then we would love to be in contact with you. So please do drop us a comment or an email and we'll get back in touch with you. But I suspect for most of us this morning, watching this video, we have made that promise before, and we live with the intention of living honestly and truthfully and sticking to that promise we made. So this passage in Matthew 5 is a reminder, as in a challenge to continue along that journey, to be truthful people, to show that our words match up with our actions. Not like the Pharisees who had lists of things that they could and couldn't do that would hold them to account. God holds us to account. Our lives are a witness to him. And so we need to live as truthful people, people of the light, people of the way, as they used to be called before they were called Christians. That's the way that we should live. Jesus is the way, Jesus is the truth, and Jesus is the life. So we need to live in a way that when our words, and just as importantly, our actions live up to that. We need to live as a people of love, demonstrating to our friends, to our neighbours, to our family, even to our enemies, that we love God, that we follow Jesus, and we want to live in his way. That's our call today, church, to live as a people of truth and love, bringing light and love to our community. That's the challenge for this week. Why don't we go and do it? Church, thank you for being together with us again. We love you. We're praying for you. Please let us know if we can help you in any way. God bless you. Amen.